Okay, could I have your attention, please? We'd like to begin the next stage of the program, a conversation with Francis Fukuyama. My name is Nader Hashemi. I'm the director of the Center for Middle East Studies at the University of Denver, and our center and our school is incredibly honored to be partnering with the Arab Center. There's an overlapping set of interests that our center focuses on with respect to the question of democracy, human rights, democratic transitions, and policy questions that makes our partnership and co-sponsoring of this event a perfect fit with the Arab Center. The focus for today's conversation, lunchtime conversation, is that I'll have a about 25, 30-minute conversation with Professor Fukuyama, and then we'll have approximately 15 minutes for questions and answers. And so I'd like to begin by really thanking Francis Fukuyama for a lifetime of intellectual contribution to American democracy, to the global public conversation on themes that really matter, and specifically for the two-volume book that you've published on the history of political order, political decay. I've had a chance to, while driving to work, listen via audio to the first volume, and I've gone through fairly quickly over the past few days volume 2, and it's a contribution that I believe will stand the test of time. And my first question to you really has to do with the book itself, the 2 volumes. You spend a lot of time focusing on really the deep lessons of history. Mm-hmm. And I'm just wondering to what extent, as an initial question, sort of the pre-modern set of political arrangements that existed really have an impact on our modern world. To what extent are contemporary societies, in this case the Arab world, let's say, prisoner or shaped by or constrained by those historical forces that emerged in the modern era? How can we wrestle with that sort of tension?
Okay, well, thank you very much, Nader, and thanks to the Arab Center and the University of Denver for inviting me. It's very nice to be with this group. There are a number of old friends here in the audience, so thanks a lot.
Great.
So the general answer, I think, is that history is never determinative. If it were determinative, you'd never have development or modernization or political change or anything else. On the other hand, it would be foolish not to be aware of certain historical legacies because they, continue to shape things into the present. And I think that that's the case, observing events in the contemporary Middle East. Now, if you'll permit me, from the book, I have a framework that I use to analyze the question of political order. And I argue that there's actually 3 separable parts of political order that you've got to distinguish from one another. So one is the state and building a state. So the state is about power, the ability to use and generate power to maintain a basic order. The second one is a rule of law that limits the state ultimately in terms of rules that constrain powerful people. And then the final one is democratic accountability, free and fair elections, or at least that's the way we interpret them. And I think that what you see is that in different parts of the world, these institutions, first of all, they don't necessarily go together. In a liberal democracy, we want some balance between all 3. But historically, these different institutions appeared at different times. And you can, in a certain sense, see how that's reflected in current arrangements. So, for example, I argue that actually the first modern, relatively impersonal state was created in China 2,300 years ago. They didn't have to do this in the modern era. That's given them a tremendous leg up in terms of their late 20th century development because they didn't have to create a state and they could simply turn back on these bureaucratic traditions that had existed a very long time. That wasn't the case in India. And then when we get to the Arab world, that's where I think the fundamental problem has been. It's not, so the democracy and the rule, well, actually, I mean, it's interesting because what I argued in the first volume of that book is that as in the Christian West, as in the Jewish tradition, and as in Hindu India, the Arab world and the Muslim world did develop rule of law fairly early on. It developed, Sharia law as a balance to political power, but the state part of it, I think, has been, problematic and kind of at the center of some of the problems that we're seeing now in the contemporary Arab Middle East.
Great. And so in volume 2 of the book, which I reread last night, you asked the question, what lessons do earlier democratic transitions hold for the future of the Middle East? And you suggest that that 19th century Europe may constitute a better precedent for political change in the Arab world than the democratic transitions associated with the third wave of democratization in Europe and in Latin America. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Sure. So what Samuel Huntington labeled the first wave of democratization is the changes in Europe that came out of the French Revolution. And there you had a kind of foundation of states and law, but you had very limited democratic participation. And the history of the 19th century was really the history of political mobilization. So even in England, that we now associate with deep democratic traditions, you didn't get to anything like universal suffrage really until the 1920s, and you didn't get universal manhood suffrage until late in the 19th century. So when I wrote that book, it was a little bit earlier on in the, after the beginning of the Arab Spring. And, what I was arguing was you can't have democracy unless you have social mobilization. And one of the arguments that had been made before 2011 is somehow the Arabs are different from other parts of the world where you don't have a vigorous civil society. People seem to be passive. They accept all these horrible authoritarian rulers, and you can't therefore have democracy unless you get angry people that really want to push for something. And I think that the Arab Spring just blew that that view apart. I mean, there's nothing cultural about it. Arabs can get as mad as anybody else. They can mobilize. In fact, the new social media contributed to that. Realization. And so I think that just as in Europe in the 19th century, in the long run, this is positive for democracy, because you just can't have democracy unless you have grassroots organization and you have people wanting to push from the bottom.
Right. And in the same chapter, you also address the obvious question that is on many people's minds, at least in the public culture, when you say that you say that there is this one factor that complicates the question of democracy in the Middle East or the Arab world, and that's the factor of religion. Or Islam. Could you say something about that?
Yeah, so I take my cue from the great social anthropologist Ernest Gellner, who was the first one, as far as I'm aware, to argue that contemporary Islamism is basically just a different version of European nationalism in the 19th century. So there's a long tradition of analyzing the rise of nationalism. It's basically something that comes out of a transition to modernity. So in Europe in the early 19th century, everybody's living in little villages, they're peasants. You have cities, but they're not that big and important. By the end of the 19th century, as a result of economic and social change, you have urbanized societies. People are taken out of their comfortable local communities. So this is what Ferdinand Tönnies referred to as a transition from Gemeinschaft to Gesellschaft. I mean, really big, from community to society. And it's very disorienting because people don't know who they are. All of a sudden they're in Berlin working in a Siemens factory. They don't know their fellow workers. And so that sociological tradition argues that this is where European nationalism comes from, because what the nationalists were able to do is say, okay, I'll tell you who you are. You're not this little Swabian peasant. You are a German because you speak German, just like your fellow, factory worker that you don't know didn't come from your village, but you have something in common. And Gellner's argument was that Islam basically has this universalizing quality to it, just like nationalism in Europe, where you have a lot of urbanization all over the Middle East. And you have actually a kind of technological modernization because people can watch satellite TV. Even if they're still in their village, they still, there are all these unfamiliar people and, movements and cultural influences. And identity gets very confused. And I think the thing that the Islamists can do is say, you're part of a universal ummah, extends from, Morocco all the way to Jakarta, and you may not know it, but it's not your little shrine, where you've been worshiping, you and your family have been worshiping, over the past, generations, but you're actually part of this much larger movement, and it answers this question of social identity. So sociologically, it plays the same role in filling a vacuum. And actually, I think it also explains why you get so many European second-generation immigrants who are culturally Muslim that sign up for this stuff, because in a sense, their sense of alienation and kind of disjunction from their local environments is even greater.
Yeah, fascinating. This morning we heard from Azmi Bushara, who raised this question of political culture and its relationship to democracy in the Arab Muslim world. And he said that the common view that many people have is that the political culture of the masses in the Arab world is fundamentally a dangerous phenomenon, and it doesn't overlap with liberal democracy. And if we give it too much credibility, it becomes a threat to at least liberal democracy. He argued, and I want to get your reaction to this. He argued that is a misreading of the situation in the Middle East. He says the problem is less the political culture of the masses rooted in some conception of Islam or religion, but it's really the political culture of the ruling elites who refuse to accept pluralism, share power, respect basic rights. And that aspect of the question of democracy in the Arab world is often forgotten in the analytical social science debate, but also at the policy level. What do you think?
That could be. I would have to think about that one, whether there's actually that elite mass division. But just on the question of political culture in general, I think you got to back up a little bit, because I just think that people misunderstand that and they misuse that term.
Yeah.
And so people argue that this is something very, deeply rooted. Sometimes, there are theories that it's even biological in nature, that there are some cultures that are inherently anti-democratic. And Westerners that argue this just don't know their own history, right? Because political cultures change. And so the idea that you should live in a liberal society that has pluralism, where tolerance becomes a central civic virtue and requirement, is not something that comes naturally to, I think, any society. It was not true in Christian Europe, in the Middle Ages. You had really 150 years of extremely bloody civil war between different factions, Protestants and Catholics, and different factions within, both of those major sects that were fighting it out. Like 2/5 of the population of Germany gets killed during the 30 Years' War, as a result of this. And if you look at where modern liberalism comes from, there are certain, I think, deeply rooted things, having to do with kind of universal human equality and dignity. But this idea that you should actually tolerate, the idea that disputes about final ends, which is what religion speaks to, that this should be pushed off into a private sphere and not be made an object of political contestation. That was not Europe in the 16th century. It became Europe after the Peace of Westphalia, because Europeans learned that it was just too damn bloody if people were arguing over final ends. And so the whole, liberal framework arises, with thinkers like Hobbes, who actually wrote in the middle of the English Civil War, religious, fundamentally religious conflict, and said, look, if you're going to survive, we have to have a different, set of values. And so everything evolves, right? And I think what's interesting right now among those elites, if it's the case that they're more at each other's throats in the Middle East, it's actually interesting to me that despite the Sunni-Shiite split in the Middle East, that goes all the way back to the days of the Prophet Muhammad, it actually hasn't been that big a source of tension, over the centuries.
Until recently.
Until recently.
Right.
And so this then makes you think, well, maybe, unfortunately, this is one of these things that has to work itself out, because people have to come to this recognition that if you actually make your sectarian, beliefs central to your politics, that given just the de facto interspersing of populations, that this is just going to be a formula for endless conflict, and therefore you actually need something like liberal tolerance if you're ever going to achieve political stability.
Okay, so now I'd like to ask you to take off your social science hat and put on your policy hat.
Yeah.
And now that we're almost at the end of 2 terms of President Obama's presidency, if you could maybe just reflect on his the legacy that he's leaving behind in the Middle East. What would you say are his major accomplishments and his major failures?
Well, I don't want to rehearse a lot of the things that were said in the previous panel. I guess, in the end, I feel a little bit more sympathetic to President Obama than many of my colleagues who are very mad at him for not having, intervened early on in the Syrian civil war. There are certain things I think that were just outright mistakes. So not following up on the red line, with regard to chemical weapons. You can say that there's too much fetishism about credibility, that's all fine. Right. But credibility is still important, right? And so it was just very bad not to actually carry through once you'd made that threat. However, so, and furthermore, I completely understand the argument that a small intervention back in 2011 or 2012 might have avoided all of the terrible things, that have happened since then. However, I think he's got this one insight which I still can't think my way past, which has to do with state building, which is that the deficit in that area right now is actually not democracy. It's just having a state, right? And so the Weberian definition of the state, it's a legitimate monopoly of force over territory, right? The legitimacy part, the force part, and the territory part are all critical to that. And right now, the big problem is that 4 important Arab states have broken down, and there is not an obvious path to creating a political unit, democratic or not, that would be regarded as sufficiently legitimate to attract, the allegiance of the populations that live there. And ultimately, you cannot control terrorism or any refugees or any of the problems coming out of that region if you do not have a path to creating a state. And I think his view is what both Afghanistan and Iraq prove is, or maybe I shouldn't attribute this to him, but this is my view. What those 2 interventions to me indicate is that it's actually easier to create some semblance of a democracy than it is to create a modern state. Both Iraq and Afghanistan, they have either elections or election-like events that produce, some degree of political legitimacy, but the big failure is in state building, where neither regime is able to control its own territory, and so forth. And so the basic problem has not been solved. And unless someone explains, how you're going to get there in terms of American policy, then, the side of caution would argue, don't get drawn into something where you're, like Libya, you're really not going to be prepared to do the things that would be necessary to actually create a state structure. So I guess I think that overlaps with his view to some extent.
Great. No, that's a perfect opportunity now to transition to the audience. And we have about 15 minutes for some questions and some comments. And I'd ask you all to keep your questions as short and succinct as possible. There are people walking around with microphones. And so someone right there has a hand, and then you're second. So, yeah, could you raise your hand? Yeah, thank you. There's a microphone coming to you right now.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry. I was a former professor at University of Tehran. Now I'm teaching at Montgomery College here. Thank you very much. It was so good. Triple, factor that you said. But with one of them, I have some kind of, let's say, comment on that. Is that nation building that which is at risk, or state building? Supposedly, we had the state in Iran, for example, but state is not a danger. But the problem is nation building. So the nation is divided. Nation in modern is the affiliation, and when they make nation, then become, okay, they make a state by a contract. And I want you to elaborate on that, please.
Okay, thank you. Well, so state building and nation building, I think, are closely related, and I think that you can't actually have a successful state if you don't have a nation alongside it. So I regard state building as just the creation of the visible institutions, armies, police, bureaucracies, parliaments, justice systems, and the like. The nation building is more of an intangible creation of a common sense of national identity, so that citizens think that their primary loyalty is to this political unit called, I don't know, France or Japan or whatever, and not to their region or their tribe or their family or whatnot. And I think that that's the clear failure in both Afghanistan and Iraq, that there never was a nation there to begin with. They're all, Afghanistan's a different issue. Iraq is a colonial creation. And then none of the leaders. So the other thing is that nation building is not, nations are not things that just lie around on the ground and they just exist from time immemorial. They're created, they're deliberately created. And nobody in Iraq ever invested in actually creating an Iraqi nation, which is why you're getting these problems today. The problem becomes much, much worse if you're a foreigner. The foreigners, through external intervention, have absolutely no way of doing this. They have no way of manipulating symbols, and they don't know enough. They have no legitimacy. So this is something that really has to be done by domestic elites. I think Iran has got a big leg up in this because they had a sense of nation, that actually way predates even Islam, and that was really never, in question for them. And therefore, they've had much more stability in state institutions and so forth. The really big problem is in the Arab world, where that sense of modern nationhood was never really forged or never had the opportunity to be forged.
Great. Yes, next question.
Marwa Mazni at the University of Washington. So I teach at the Jackson School of International Studies, and your piece on the end of history has always been put back to back with Huntington's Clash of Civilization. And we have the students kind of see these outlooks on things. And definitely the uprisings at the beginning seemed like the end of history was the winning part of the argument, more or less. We're all going to liberalism, this is the path, this is where things are. Do you see that actually, it seems like Huntington's Clash of Civilization, despite the point that the previous panel was raising about Obama's being more of a Fukuyamaist, that we ended up being in the Huntingtonian corner. And if you can make a comment on that, and actually policy making, when you have that vision or that vision, how does it interact with the academic intellect? Thank you.
Well, if you actually read the book version of The End of History carefully, I make this argument about recognition and dignity, that that politics really is about a struggle for recognition. This was Hegel's original insight. But I say that the liberal form of recognition is universal human recognition, recognition of the dignity of every human being on an equal basis. But it's got big competitors out there, in particular religion and nationalism, which are alternative forms of recognition. And I would say right now, it's a big question, and I think one of the most upsetting things so it's been upsetting that there's been what my colleague Larry Diamond calls this democratic recession over the past 10 years in terms of the major trends, towards democracy and, away from democracy and towards, authoritarian government. But probably the most upsetting thing is actually what's happened in this country in the last few months, where it's clear that even established democracies can go backwards in terms of the sorts of norms that, that underpin this kind of democratic universalism. Now, if I was giving, a full answer, I would go into a lot of the themes that are in the last, the 2-volume book that Nader referred to, because I also, I talk about this question of political decay, which was not part of my original thesis, because it seems to me that all modern political systems are subject to decay. They're subject to being captured by their own elites. It's hard to maintain, it's hard to get to a modern state, and it's also very easy to move away from it because there's kind of a natural instinct that people have to favor friends and family. Modern state requires impersonality, and so it's constantly under threat. And I would say, it's under threat in the homeland of democracy today. So, we all need to think about that.
Okay, yes, Munji.
Munji Dawadi from the Center of the Study of Islam and Democracy. Don't you think that the Arab Spring was more of a referendum on the legitimacy of the Arab leaders, saying that enough is enough? I mean, the legitimacy has to go through the people?
Yes, no, I think that, absolutely. I think that's why people were so hopeful about it in the early days. So, look, this is getting into an area that's way beyond my expertise, but it did seem to me that several things kind of intervened later. So first of all, you've got the same class divisions that you do in other parts of the world, where the people that were the most liberal and actually wanted to replace these rotten authoritarian leaders with something more democratic tended to be more urban, younger, better educated, and so forth. And then in a country like Egypt, you've then got a larger population that's less educated, more rural, more of the support base of the, the Muslim Brotherhood and other forces that are less, interested in that agenda, and they happen to be much more organized. And one, I think, almost universal characteristic of all of the more liberal groups that support these color revolutions, whether it's Ukraine or Russia or, Tahrir Square, is they don't know how to organize. They really don't know how to organize, and so even up to the election that brought Morsi to power, if the liberals had stayed together and had been more cohesive, it's not clear that they would have lost that election. And so I do think that there was a lot to work with. There. So yes, I guess my answer to your question is fundamentally yes.
Yes, right there. And feel free to identify yourself if you'd like to. I mean, that's completely optional.
Yeah, I'm Mike Springman. I'm a former diplomat with 2 degrees in foreign affairs, and I'm the author of Visas for Al-Qaeda, CIA Handouts to Rock the World. You can get it at michaelspringman.com. I've got to say that we've heard an awful lot of platitudes and generalities today, but there has not been any explanation of why the United States has deliberately targeted the secular states of Iraq, Syria, Libya, and now Yemen. And yet the repressive and repulsive allies of the United States in the region, Israel, the Gulf states, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia, have been untouched. Do you have an explanation for this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that American foreign policy has been driven by a lot of perceived interests, some of which I think over the years were not terribly well thought out. I think it's pretty obvious why we have not targeted Saudi Arabia. Even to this day, I mean, now that we need Saudi Arabia a lot less, I don't think any American wants to see it particularly destabilized, because what's going to come out of a unstable Saudi Arabia could be, a lot worse than this very imperfect relationship we have now. I don't think we got to rehearse the whole set of arguments that led up to the intervention against Saddam Hussein. I think a lot of those arguments were profoundly mistaken, particularly because a lot of the authors of that really did think that somehow they persuaded themselves that this was actually a fight in favor of democracy as opposed to replacing a Sunni power with a Shiite power and so forth. So, but I don't think that there's a conspiracy narrative that I would draw that explains all of those decisions. I think they're driven by specific assumptions and then misunderstandings, in each separate case.
Okay, next question. Oh. Okay.
My name is Yaya Fanusi. I'm with US Africa 2017 project as well. I've not read your two books. So the way I cannot critique you, and that's basic. But I will ask you this question. How did you deal with the concept of reification and the process of reification in the subject matter? And how were you able to detach your ideological position to the subject matter you studied? I'm a PhD in that area, so answer the question.
Wait, I didn't catch the word. Why didn't I talk about what?
No, how did you deal with the process, the concept and process of reification?
Reification?
Reification.
Reification. And secondly, how were you able to restrain your ideological predisposition to the subject matter so that it doesn't affect your conclusion? I'm a PhD in that area.
Well, I guess I don't know how to answer that because I never dealt with I don't know what you mean by reification.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems like it's too abstract without any context. Let me just pose a question to you now that we're getting near the end of this session. As a student and scholar of democracy and someone who's also engaged in debates on U.S. foreign policy, one of the things that sort of strikes me about where we are today as a country with respect to the Middle East and the Arab Islamic world is that there's very little interest in Washington to think about a longer-term grand strategy for the Middle East. We seem to be simply pursuing a policy that's putting out fires. And now we're at this moment where, because of the crumbling of states, we've fallen back to our old ways, where we're thinking that the old dictators and despots are going to preserve our stability, and that's a way out of the current crisis. But there seems to be very little thinking public debate about where we'd like to see the Middle East in 20 years, 30 years, and how can we start to pursue policies that can build those political institutions that you talk about in this book that are so necessary for a stable political order. Could you comment on that topic? It's really a foreign policy question.
Yeah. I don't know. I guess my feeling is that, especially in the Middle East, given all of these misperceptions and a history of pretty bad decision-making on a lot of different subjects and mistaken interventions and, so on and so forth, I actually am not sure that it would be great to come up with a long-term grand strategy short of, these aspirational goals that we would like a peaceful, pluralistic, democratic region and the like. But I think that if you get too specific in trying to map your way to this, you immediately run into all of these questions. I mean, one of the basic questions is knowledge. So there's a lot of knowledge here in this room, in the US government. The number of people that actually have a deep understanding of that region is very limited. And in fact, one of the things that I thought ever since September 11th, during the Cold War, when we thought that we had this long-term problem with the Soviet Union, we really ramped up our ability to actually understand, people that could speak Russian and kind of understood the society to the extent we could back then. We haven't made a comparable effort, in this country. And so I would just worry about people like me, kind of running around with big theories, trying to set foreign policy based on those theories when, the level of understanding is what it is.
Right. Okay, maybe have time for maybe one or two more questions. Right there. There's a I think there's a microphone circulating somewhere so that everyone can hear. Here, it's coming. Right here at the front. Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to hear your comments about, do you think that the geographic closeness between the European and the Arab worlds is the source of friction which is taking place
Yes.
between the values of both? Though we have a lot of mutual interest, we have a lot actually we are sharing the same sea at least. So what are your comments about that?
Well, so this is something that's occurred to me in recent days. So I don't want to at all underplay the magnitude of the Syrian crisis and just the sheer level, 400,000 people killed and, millions made homeless. But it does seem to me that the proximity of Syria to Europe has made people much more conscious of this conflict than other conflicts that are of a similar scale that have happened recently where you don't have that kind of contact. So for example, Democratic Republic of Congo, right? In the past 10, 15 years, they've had a civil conflict that has produced, by some estimates, 5 million casualties and then equal numbers of displaced persons. And how much discussion do you have in policy circles about moral need to intervene and do something about that? There's still this very nasty conflict going on in South Sudan, where the United States actually shepherded this whole country into being. And again, there's no discussion of this because I suspect that it's really hard to get from South Sudan to Europe or to the United States or Australia or any place where people will start paying attention. So I don't want this to suggest that I want to downplay the magnitude of what's happened in Syria, but I do think that ultimately Western publics follow their own self-interest, and the major self-interest has really now been defined in terms of refugees and the like, for better or worse, and that in turn is determined by geography.
Well, on that note, please join me in thanking Professor Fukuyama for being with us today. And at 2 o'clock, I think in about 15 minutes, we'll start the next session in the room that we began with in the morning. Thank you.
Okay.